Hello, I'm David Kataforis, professor and chair of art history at the University of Kansas. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the state of Kansas occupies the ancestral homelands or former territories of many tribal nations. The University of Kansas is situated on or near lands forcefully ceded to the United States by the Kansa in an 1825 treaty and by the Shawnee in an 1854 treaty. In remembering this history, we honor an enduring relationship that ties many indigenous peoples to this land. Among these communities, I recognize the sovereignty of the four federally recognized tribal nations present in Kansas today: the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Sac and Fox, and Iowa. With these acknowledgments, I invite all of us to be attentive to the entwinement of our intellectual work with the past, present, and future of the places in which we meet and think. I also encourage anyone with the means to do so to support Indigenous communities materially by contributing to the Haskell Foundation to benefit the mission of the Haskell Indian Nations University here in Lawrence. Tonight, we present another lecture in our series, Intersections of Identity, Expression, Exchange, and Hybridity. The series asks what constitutes identity, how do people navigate, form, and reform their sense of self, and how can the study of art and its history help us to consider the diverse identities expressed by visual culture and its creators. We seek to amplify the voices of scholars and artists and curators whose work explores individual and collective identities as those intersect with notions of the body, disability, gender, heritage, and race. The series is organized by KU's Crest Foundation Department of Art History and the graduate students of the History of Art. It's sponsored by the Franklin Murphy Lecture Fund. The graduate students and I are grateful to Art History Department Administrative Associate Joanna Ritt for her organizational help, including the poster design. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Megan Wanttie, who is a museum educator with a strong background in museum programming, collections-based research, and interpretive design. Her practice seeks to address contemporary social justice issues through digital integration within and outside the museum space. Dr. Wanttie is currently manager of family and youth programming at the Columbus Museum of Art in Ohio and a lecturer at The Ohio State University. She earned her Ph.D. from Ohio State in Arts Administration, Education, and Policy with a specialization in museum education and administration. She completed her dissertation with the support of a Manuel Barkon Dissertation Fellowship Award. Prior to her study at OSU, she studied art education at the Ph.D. level at the Pennsylvania State University. She earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in art history from the University of North Texas, along with a graduate certificate in art museum education from UNT. At UNT, she served as president of the Art History Society, the school's undergraduate and graduate art history association, and she served for 2 years as president of the Ohio State AAEP Graduate Student Association. Dr. Wanttie's teaching experience includes work as an adjunct instructor with the Columbus College of Art and Design, graduate teaching assistants at UNT and Ohio State. She held internships at the Dallas Museum of Art and the Palmer Museum of Art, and has been involved with the National Art Education Association programs around disability studies and art education. Dr. Wanttie is co-author of Imagining the Not Museum: Power, Pleasure, and Radical Museological Community, published in the Journal of Cultural Research and Art Education in 2020, and her article Movement in Museums: Using Movement as Embodied Learning is forthcoming in Visual Inquiry. She's curated exhibitions at the Palmer Museum of Art and Columbus College of Art and Design, and given numerous public gallery and academic talks. This evening, she'll speak about critical posthumanism in art museums. After the talk, a Q&A moderated by Daisuke Murata will be conducted, so please enter your questions into the chat in YouTube. And I'm now happy to turn the screen over to Dr. Wanttie.
Hello, thank you. Good evening. I'll share my screen. Thank you for that lovely introduction. As I have been introduced, my name is Dr. Megan Wanttie, and I am very pleased to be with you all this evening. My research explores alternative ways of knowing, being, and doing in the art museum informed by critical posthumanism, critical race theory, critical disability studies, and queer theory. In this research, I have explored how critical posthuman pedagogy can provide an opportunity for museums to reimagine the processes that construct our definitions of what humanity is and can be, of what art, artists, viewers, and participants can be. Through this process, the mechanisms of knowledge construction and dissemination within the museum are profoundly questioned with the intention of disrupting the presumed humanist neoliberal museum subject. Critical posthumanism provides a way to understand and restructure expectations of the educational goals of museums, as well as incorporate a multitude of ontological considerations through critical race theory, queer theory, and critical disability studies. Before I get started, I want to cover a few key terms that I will use frequently this evening. When I was a graduate student, I remember coming across these terms and just kind of feeling a little bit lost. So I wanted to start by just defining them for everyone, reminding everyone. So ontology is a way of being, epistemology is a way of knowing, pedagogy is a way of teaching, hegemony is sameness or dominance, and taxonomy is a system of classification. I found that when talking about all of these theoretical concepts, it's really important to be specific with terminology. So having that shared understanding is great to start with. Embedded within both critical disability studies and posthumanism is a desire to reassess the category of quote unquote human. Rooted firmly in parallel impulses, both critical disability studies and posthumanism seek to destabilize notions of closed categories and value-based hierarchical distinctions while simultaneously providing opportunities to explore alternative ways of being, doing, and knowing. Despite this, it is important to recognize that both disability and posthumanism cannot be considered constant, uniform, or encompassing categories of thought. In fact, both theoretical frameworks seek to trouble any type of essentialized definition. For this reason, we must recognize that the two fields are not reducible to one another. They may be in direct conflict, and that friction between the two might actually be generative. As a disruptive social theory, queer theory is engaged in questions around non-humanity, dehumanizing, and posthumanism in many parallel ways to critical disability studies. Both queer and the posthuman are direct challenges to what it means to count as human, corporeally and discursively, in body and in discussion. The queer not only exists outside the boundaries of human, but it seeks to disrupt and deconstruct the binary systems that center around gender, sexuality, and ways of being. With this, both the queer and the posthuman are positioned as deviations from the normative humanist structure that limits ways of knowing, being, and doing. Unlike disability and queerness, race and critical race theory are not so embedded within posthumanism. Though posthumanism repeatedly questions the distinctions and categorizations of human, race has not been an integral conversation within posthumanist thought. Critical race theorists and others who are most dedicated to questions surrounding the roles of race within global society have at best met posthumanism with skepticism. Central to many of the concerns is the posthuman does not adequately engage with the consequences of whiteness, of humanism, and with this construction of the so-called man, capital M, man, for anyone except for the white theorists who are writing about it. Critical race theory grapples with the insufficiency of posthumanism as a theoretical framework, especially as related to the non-representational subject. Ultimately, it is only through the multiple overlapping, excuse me, I've lost my slide order. Ultimately, it is only through these kind of multiple overlapping, divergent, and experimental uses of the frameworks that critical posthumanism can find meaningful ways to engage with the contemporary human and non-human subject. Posthumanism has a varied and sometimes conflicting strands within the larger theoretical framework, initially stemming from ecology and environmentalism, cybernetics, technology, informatics, and philosophy. The term posthumanism can be found in a lot of different disciplines. Ultimately, the posthuman turn is a response to the rejection of the Eurocentric universal man as a taxonomy. The humanist approach to classification, definition, and exclusion has been met with criticism from many who see the human, capital H human, as an oppressive, harmful category rather than an intrinsic truth about the species. It's important to recognize that the posthuman is both situated and partial. On its own, it simply offers a different way to observe and analyze current situations rather than a means to disassemble power imbalances within society. So, to clarify, an uncritical posthumanism is an observant framework. It might conceptually deconstruct, but it's not primarily concerned with the active dismantling of hegemonic and harmful structures or the rewriting of relationships between human and non-human actors. A genealogy of posthumanism can help decipher where the roots of the movement are in order to make sense of the driving factors of critical posthumanism. First, posthumanism can be connected to the post-structuralists. For these theorists, there's a clear influence of anti-universalism and anti-colonial frameworks, which elucidate the significance of the theory alongside other disruptive frameworks. Further, French philosopher Foucault, American philosopher Donna Haraway, and French philosopher and psychoanalyst Deleuze and Guattari are influential theorists in the genealogy of posthumanist thought. These theorists criticize state-sanctioned history and power, the study and emergence of unfamiliar and altered life forms, and seek to break from hegemonic hierarchical systems in the construction of the posthuman field of scholarship. Combined, this set of theorists points toward a practice of knowledge production that is cognizant of the historical significance and consequences of writing and rewriting both futures and histories. Critical posthumanism, critical disability studies, queer theory, and critical race theory together have the potential to recognize a more fully formed human and non-human hybrid subject. I would like to emphasize the importance of not reducing or flattening each of these disruptive theories into one another. Critical posthumanism seeks to find expansive and unbounded theoretical space, but it is imperative that we attend to the material realities and consequences of the theoretical practices called upon in this research. We must ask how we can respond to the ways that posthumanism continues to privilege the white neoliberal subject, even in critical posthumanist spaces. We also must ask, what are the ways we can move into new futures unbridled from the humanist subject without erasing the history of oppression and marginalization at the hands of the capital H human? It will be important to find ways to coalesce these disruptive theories without degrading the key contributions each makes in the recognition of a more fully defined and realized future. Throughout the span of Western human history, education has operated as an enlightenment project with the goal of increasing the valuable participation of humans in society. The constructed architecture of Western society, rooted in humanist ideology, has led to the value-laden description of humanity as we have come to know it, ultimately placing the so-called human at the pinnacle of knowledge construction. Consequently, the education that stems from this set of beliefs has functioned as a way of perpetuating, validating, and reproducing inequity. Rooted in this worldview is the Western Art Museum. It has historically functioned as a space of exclusion and hierarchical knowledge through exhibition and acquisition practices, resulting in the creation and perpetuation of a singular, elitist, and Western perspective. The dissemination of this worldview holds myriad consequences for both the individual group and the local global environments. Fixed in these historically humanist privileges of knowledge and being, museums have yet to embrace the plurality of realities and possibilities available to them. The flaw with humanist education is that it sees only one encircled path to so-called enlightenment. It forecloses the potential for multitudes and is therefore actually anti-human. A posthuman education seeks to embrace the infinite realities within humanity and open up the potential for greater things. Critical posthuman education defies hierarchical structures of knowledge to better reflect the interconnectedness and expansiveness of the ecological and experiential nature of life. Further, the bond between humanist discourse and colonial practices is fundamental, and embracing a critical posthuman paradigmatic shift must incur deliberate commitments to these decolonial practices and an attention to the power dynamics within an institution that collects objects from around the world. In the humanist system of deciding what traits apply to human and what it means to be fully human lies the implicit practice of coding certain things, places, and people as less than human, and therefore lesser than. Embedded in this intricate web of ontology and epistemology are the lived consequences of the humanist paradigm, the realization that the experience of human exists within the bounds and standards of a select few. The role and function of museums has shifted through time. Though never completely unified or centralized, Western museums have evolved over the past few hundred years in an analogous course. Stemming from so-called princely collections and cabinets of curiosity from the early 16th to 18th centuries, the practice of collecting objects for edification and education is a long-standing tradition in the Western world. The transformation of something akin to the museum we see today began in the late 19th century alongside changes in the global population and the eruption of industrialized cities in the West. Through this period, the role of the museum as public tastemaker and institution of knowledge was solidified. It was also here that the museum first identified the role it would take on in the creation of a civilized public via exposure to quote unquote high art and beautiful objects. Thus, the role of the museum has always been embedded in two parallel impetuses: the desire to collect and the desire to influence. As we reevaluate the role that 21st century museums should have in our contemporary communities and societies, it is important to recognize that the impetuses that drive museums are embedded in practices of colonization, knowledge production, and erasure. Though often thought of as spaces dedicated to the exploration of truth, history, and so-called great men, the modern museum has been criticized in recent years for perpetuating systems of oppression and exclusion. Contemporary, socially responsive museums have the responsibility to recognize their own sources of power, privilege, and the ability to construct knowledge. This is done in order to participate in the creation of a more humane, just, and progressive future. Sorry, my slides are messed up again. My bad. Museums are at the precipice of a new age of social engagement, connection, and outreach, set to grapple with the complex and messy history of the United States and the consequences of the Western world in new and immediate terms. Practitioners must take it upon themselves to begin this process of reassessing and shifting our goals and practices within our institutions. Though certainly bound to the realities of our shared histories, museums must seek out opportunities to look to the future for potentials as to what they may become. Current designs of many art museums imply a narrative that privileges the Western elite. Changing the atmosphere of museum spaces through an upheaval of the standard flows of movement encourages non-traditional modes of thinking, which can lead to the emergence of unintended narratives. While generally speaking, we often have little control of the built environment of the museum, advocating for alternative ways of thinking, knowing, and moving can conceivably inflect the environment by moving against the design flow of movement in experimental ways. The primary goal of using physical movement in museum spaces is to destabilize institutional power put in place through spoken and unspoken rules of conduct erected through architectural design in order to allow the visitor to better talk about, experience, and appreciate art. In providing alternative ways of moving in museums, one can encourage alternative ways of thinking, of knowing, and of speaking through processes that prioritize the viewer and desanctify the museum space. The call for physical responses to the affective qualities of an object and museum environment dismantles the cultural and architectural barriers that construct the museum and gallery space to better prioritize the experience of the viewer, rather than simply the intents of the museum as an institution. Additionally, the use of movement may lead to a deeper understanding that exists beyond the limits of language. If we consider the architectural design of the museum space as stagnant, as it most often is, but the ways in which we move within the space as ever-changing and fluid, it is conceivable that we can facilitate experimentation with notions of self, relationship to the local and worldwide community, and greater understandings of materiality, both in the object and in the person, in the experience of the person. Compare, for example, how one might stand to embody Christ in Rubens' Raising of the Cross to Philip IV in Velázquez's portrait of Philip IV, King of Spain. In Rubens' painting of Christ, there is a clear energy and strength of movement that is implied through the diagonal and overlapping composition that can be physically felt when taking the position of Christ. This kind of energy and dynamism is missing if you were to stand in the form of Philip IV. Beyond mimicking the stance of figural paintings, however, I consider how one might stand to move to embody a piece of Sèvres porcelain or Louise Bourgeois' Maman. What type of movements are inspired through slow looking at a non-figural, sculptural, or ephemeral art object? What does it feel and look like to be a material? How do the formal characteristics of a piece lend themselves to communicate something about the art object, whether it be contextual or historical information about the piece, or something much more dependent on the interpretation of the viewer? And more than that, how can we move our bodies to express this complexity? You can also ask, how does the agency and the affective nature of the material of these objects impose itself on the human body? And then how can we embody that tension? Beyond the clear level of experimentation and improvisation used when asking someone to embody a piece of work, to be the material, to feel the object, giving the visitor the agency to decide what they think, what they feel, and decipher what they see dismantles systems of power in the museum setting by removing the assumption that the museum knows something that you, as the visitor, do not. This photograph is from a recent tour at the museum that I work at with a small group of high school students. During this tour, I asked the students to spend some time looking around the galleries and see what they were drawn to. Then we spent time as a group going to each of these different pieces that different students had selected. During our discussion on this particular piece, one student mentioned that it reminded them of music. In this photograph here, there's a Frank Stella in the background that has this three-dimensional energy. There's this, it's a very, very large monumental piece on the wall. There are lots of different shapes and forms that come out at different angles, like three-dimensionally from the piece. There's very thick lines, there's very bright contrasting colors, there's some pieces that disappear behind other shapes and other forms that give it this really dynamic quality when you're looking at it. In this photograph, there are several students that are standing in front of this painting, or this piece rather, that are expressing their experience of this piece in different ways. Some of them have their arms outstretched, reached up over their head. Some of them are kind of posing with friends. One student is sitting on the ground with both of their arms and legs spread out as wide as they can. And this photograph really represents that experience and that moment in time. In this discussion with this, they had mentioned that it felt like music or it looked like music. So I had asked them to think deeply about how the rhythm of the piece could be felt within their body. And I asked them to think about what type of music the piece reminded them of. And some of them had immediately kind of started moving their bodies quickly and in short bursts. Some of them extended their arms wide, some of them kept them in closer. Others began to kind of undulate and move their bodies a lot slower than I would have expected, and started building like beats with their feet and clapping in this way. So after they expressed these different feelings with their bodies, we discussed what formal qualities from the piece contributed to these different feelings and sounds, and how they kind of came to those conclusions in that experience. What was really special about this moment is that it combined a period of discussion-based touring alongside slow looking and movement, which deepened the students' knowledge and feeling of connection and agency over that work. We had them back a little while later for another program, and several of them brought friends or family over to that piece and felt this deeper connection with this piece than any of the others that we spent time talking about after this experience. Okay. Nope. Apologies, I'm missing several of my slides. So oftentimes when discussing a theory, we talk about applying a lens to what we see. Critical posthumanism asks you to embody a change in being and in self. It isn't simply about applying one particular tactic or technique to your work. Instead, it requires you to devote yourself to a constant state of development and growth. One of my favorite quotes that I came across early in this process is, "Ontological change is not comfortable." That is, changing your way of being is not comfortable. It is challenging and difficult to question the things you love and who you are, but it is imperative that we do so in order to build a more just and equitable society. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Daisuke will join us.
Yep. Thank you very much, Megan, Dr. Wanttie. I am joining as a moderator for this Q&A section. My name is Daisuke, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Kansas, the Art History Department. I'm also one of the committee members for this lecture series. Thank you very much for this wonderful, insightful talk and sharing your very exciting but also challenging mission that you're conducting at the museum you work at. I want to start with my own question, if I may. You were introducing at the very end of your talk, the actual educational program that you conducted with high school students in front of the piece by Frank Stella, I believe. And I believe you, but in addition to that experience, I believe you have encountered a number of times that those participants offer some interpretations or impressions or feelings that are not really correspond to the established art historical understanding of the pieces. Or sometimes if you know the artist's original intentions or ideas expressed through those pieces, sometimes I believe sometimes you encounter those reactions are completely different from what their intentions were originally. So how do you approach those situations like this? If you can introduce some examples of your experiences with educational programs, that would be great.
Absolutely. Yes, this happens very, very often. So when you are doing something like a discussion-based tour, where you start by asking something along the lines of, what do you see? You're opening this conversation up to a ton of unexpected responses that may not actually be aligned with what is written about the work or what you know about the history of the work. For me, it's important to not let that kind of misunderstanding move forward. So what I typically will do is I will talk through how they came to that conclusion and try to understand what it is that they are seeing and what they have experienced that is telling them something about that piece. So, for example, I was doing a tour fairly recently with another group of students, and we were looking at this abstract piece. It is called Madonna and Child, but when you're looking at it, it's not figural. So there are several pieces that are kind of constructed together. They are found objects that are put together in this way that, if you are familiar with the art historical Madonna and Child motif, you might understand that one of the larger figures and one of the smaller figures combined represent this moment. For people who are not so familiar with that type of imagery, that connection is difficult to get to. So I had some of these students who were looking at it recently, and they were telling me that it was probably something about car parts, or like building a home, or something else that was really related to what they had experienced in their lives. They recognized some of those materials as being related to like building something, fixing something, something along those lines. So when we were having that conversation, it was important to really pull apart where that understanding was coming from, and not only like understand where it's coming from, but validate what they're seeing and validate that connection that they're making, while also offering that secondary layer of interpretation on top of it. Because it would be, I think, a disservice to people who come into the museum to ask them to make these kinds of interpretations without providing that expert interpretation with them. But you also don't want to undermine what they're seeing, because really what you're trying to do is build that capacity for looking and for learning.
Thank you. That's a beautiful answer. Thank you very much. There's another question from our PhD student, Logan. How do you think these types of learning through movement can be applied in environments outside of museums, such as a classroom?
I actually think that incorporating movement into a classroom might be a little bit, maybe not easier, but it might be a little bit simpler to get the necessary trust and connection with your students. In a museum setting, one of the most tricky things is that most of the time you are encountering people that you are going to see once, twice, 3 times if you're really lucky. But you have to be able to build this rapport with people and this level of trust to get them to move their body in a strange way in a new place. In a classroom, you can start to embed these things in a fairly similar way. Asking people to interpret things small helps. So like, you don't have to do these huge gestures straight off the bat. You can say like, move your fingers in a way that reminds you of this piece that you're looking at, or connects you to this piece. And that might encourage them to build bigger and build better in that process. But really at the heart of it is building that trust and that rapport with people. Doing it alongside them is really important. So whenever I do this, I never ask people to be like, okay, now you do this. I'm just going to stand here with my arms crossed and stare at you. I will do it with them. I will start moving, even though it makes me a little bit uncomfortable, if I'm being honest. Like I also feel that kind of pressure being in the museum space to be a certain way, to articulate things in a certain way. Yeah, so I think building trust with them, letting them know that you're going to do it too, and then starting small and building bigger is helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Trust is one of the very important aspects that you really have to think about when looking at pieces at a museum setting or public space, whether you can really trust the atmosphere or the environment that you are in. Okay. Another question is from our graduate student, PhD student from Hejon. How do you get students or museum learners to actually engage and participate during these discussions? I sometimes find it difficult to get people to actually participate.
Yes, this can be really difficult. I think whenever I start a tour, I start with as few expectations as possible. When we come up to a piece of art, I usually will ask them to spend some time observing, take some time to look, see what stands out to you, and then share some of what you see. When they start sharing, it's helpful to repeat back to them what it is that they've said, not only so that they understand that you're listening to them, but also so that you are understanding what they're saying. So repeating back can be helpful. As you start encouraging them in that way, you can support their looking by modeling what you're looking for as well. So if I have one person say, oh, I'm looking at this piece and I see all these different colors, they're kind of ugly together. I'll repeat back, well, okay, so we're looking at this piece. there are all of these juxtapositions and contrasts with color that are not immediately appealing to our eye. What more can you say about that? What else can you find? And it helps them understand what you're looking for, how to participate, and also supports their learning as well. It gives them some key terms a lot of times and helps them deepen their desire to look. Yeah, I think that was all I meant to say there.
Thank you. I have a very many different questions as well, but one of the questions I had was you particularly used the term slow looking in your talk. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Mm-hmm. Slow looking is a technique that comes from a practitioner and scholar, Peter Clothier, I think is how you say his name, Clothier. You can tell I read more than I talk about him. But he started this practice of slow looking with this program called 1 Hour, 1 Painting, in which he asks people to stand in front of a painting for literally 1 hour and to spend time with that piece. Now, this is like really difficult to get anyone to do. We're talking about like getting people to buy into your program. Asking people to stand in front of a single piece of art for an hour with nothing else is really, really tough. But you can start it smaller. You can have some of the positive effects, which include like an increased knowledge about the piece, like a familiarity with the qualities of the piece. You have oftentimes this sense of agency that comes with it. People, when you do these kind of slow looking exercises, refer to the pieces as my piece, and they feel really connected to the piece in a deep way. So that's where that slow looking term comes from. And essentially, it is asking you to slow down your looking, as the term suggests, in order to kind of break the habit of not really engaging with the piece deeply. There are all of these studies that point to like the incredibly quick, like the fast turnaround that people have when they come up to paintings when they're in the museum or art objects. I think it's just a couple seconds is the average amount of time that people spend with artworks in museums. And a lot of times that is drawn from, or I'm sorry, that a lot of times that time is coming from reading the label more than even looking at the piece. So slow looking and practices that involve slow looking are meant to kind of circumvent that, to ask you, instead of paying more attention to what somebody tells you is important about the piece, is to decide that for yourself, to spend time with the piece. And it's especially, I think, valuable for pieces that you don't like, because it gives you an appreciation for them and maybe even a deeper understanding of the piece through that process.
Have you actually done 1 hour looking program?
I have, yeah, I have. I mean, I do it pretty often, not a full hour most of the time, but I have done the full hour a couple different times. And I will say it's I don't know if anyone is really into like meditation, but if you meditate a lot, you get into this like headspace where everything changes like at this incredible level that is very, very difficult to explain. But it's kind of like meditation. It's kind of like connecting yourself to that piece. And I found for myself, when I do it, I start moving, which is where the movement in museums kind of came from, is this kind of like, okay, I'm not only like moving in response to the piece, but it's like I'm moving around the piece and I are in this kind of like dance or movement together because we're in this space for an extended amount of time together. And it's more than just like taking a pose that makes you understand like the weight and the distribution of the body and that kind of thing. It's about like trying to get at that really hard to explain quality of like yourself with a piece of artwork.
Great, thank you. We have two more questions from the audience. Says, I was interested to see your genealogy of posthumanism and especially the critiques from some other theoretical strands like CRT. I also noticed you mentioned ecology, so I was wondering what your thoughts are on the connection between eco-criticism and posthumanism. Can you recommend any scholars to read for applications of posthuman in art studies broadly?
Mm-hmm. This is a tricky question to answer succinctly. I have a lot of references that I would be very happy to share with anyone who can email me. I provided my email on the list there. I think at the core of your question is about some of these criticisms and where they're coming from, why they're happening. Let me see if I can pull open the chat and read it again, just to remind myself. I don't know if I have an exact like good answer for this question. This is a great question. I know that the critiques from critical race theory were really important in the work that I did for my dissertation research, in that most of my dissertation research also looked at the possibilities for social and mobile technologies alongside critical posthumanism in museums. And there's this very long history of the ways that race intersects with technologies and deepens oppression and deepens layers of oppression. Yes, I guess I think that's the best answer. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
Thank you. So another question from the YouTube audience. So does the method of using movement as an approach to interpretation has age limit or age limitation?
No, I don't think so. I do think that you will get different types of difficulties with different age groups. It's certainly more difficult to get adults to participate in experimental ways of experiencing the art, because we are kind of we're in this kind of codified sense of like how you behave in the public and maybe even how you experience art in an art museum. That certainly can be tricky. There's not like a surefire way of getting people to buy in on that. But again, I think that trust and like also you doing it alongside them can be helpful. But you will sometimes just get people who are like, no, I'm not going to do that. And that's okay. In those moments, I think what's important is finding small wins. So like if you have someone come in who just is not having it, they have no interest in doing what you want them to do, trying to find ways to get them a little bit closer to that goal throughout your visit, I think is also an equal win. Because as I've mentioned, museum work, you are lucky if you get to see them a few different times. So you have these like really brief moments with people. And sometimes the absolute best thing that you can hope for is just a tiny little shift in their perspective or understanding. And that can come through discussion. That doesn't necessarily have to come through movement, even though you could, start moving yourself as you're describing the piece, and maybe that starts to get them thinking and shifting their perspective on that as well. it can also be difficult for littles. If you have little kids in there in the museum space, that can be tricky for movement because they don't often know their own limitations on how much movement they can do. So it helps to give very, very specific directions with kids that are maybe, teens and younger, because they hear, move in response, and suddenly they're ping ponging around the gallery, and you have to like try to problem solve that. Um, so I don't think that it doesn't have an age limit, but there are considerations and maybe even limitations for different age groups. Mhm.
Megan, I'll just jump in and offer something that might help with the convincing people of the value of slow looking.
Mhm.
And I want to find the exact source of this quote, but I believe it was the art critic Thomas Hess who said it should take as long to look at a painting as it takes to read a novel.
Mm, that's beautiful. I think that's true as well. Um, yeah, one thing that really hasn't come up yet, but that reminds me of is when you return to pieces over and over again, that experience changes so significantly and so drastically. There's a piece at the Columbus Museum of Art that I have a very special connection with. It's called Sound Suit. And it is a piece that I first experienced at the Pizzuti, which is like an extension of CMA, prior to the pandemic. We were doing some programming in our graduate studies. Logan, you might have been in this class actually. I can't recall exactly. It's been a while. And yes, he was. We had spent time with that piece and we were developing different programs for that piece. And then suddenly the pandemic happened and all of that programming got canceled. And suddenly it had been 2 years since I had been in an art museum. And on my first visit back to an art museum, I came across that piece. I came around the corner and was just confronted with that piece. And I started sobbing because
Mm.
I had this like visceral memory with that piece. And suddenly all like everything that had happened since I saw that piece the last time up until that moment just kind of collapsed in on itself. And it was just this huge, visceral reaction. Um, and I think that is just so powerful. I tell that story kind of often because it is just such an overwhelmingly big moment for me. But I see it now working at the CMA and I see it now in the galleries. And I always get this moment of like, I wonder what it's going to be like when I see this piece in 20 years,
Mhm.
after having kind of lived with it for this time as well. And yeah, there's just something really special, I think, about coming back to it and spending so much time with pieces throughout your life. Mhm.
Any more questions coming in through the chat? You have a great
No,
collection. Sorry? Okay. You have a great collection to work with there at Columbus. You
Mhm.
have the Ferdinand Howald collection of American modernism. That must be a treat.
We have so many really, really incredible pieces there. And we were talking a little bit before this all started, this talk started about the different ways that curatorial and education are working together to really bridge that gap between the spaces. And we're coming up with really like, it's just a really beautiful time to be working there, to have this opportunity to work in these experimental ways alongside art historians and working together to really build something unique.
Well, we wish you the best as you continue that work. We've learned a lot from you this evening, taken some ideas from this conversation that maybe will have applicability in our work. And that's what this is all about.
Thank you so much. I've had a really great time, and I really appreciate being part of this evening, and really appreciate the questions that you brought up. I'll have to look into eco-criticism and posthumanism for Logan's question and do a little more digging on my own.
Thank you. And we'll look into some of the references you gave us. And the next time we're in front of a Frank Stella, we may strike a pose.
Wonderful.
All right. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. This will be posted on our KU Art History YouTube channel for future viewing. And we will say thank you again to Dr. Megan Wanttie and goodbye.